At 12:45 on the 16th of November, 1944, in the gray, wet edge of the Hürtgen forest, a German engineer officer checked his watch inside a low, concrete shelter set into the hills east of Aachen. The air still carried the faint aftertaste of the midday bombing, distant, muffled concussions that had rolled across the Roer Valley between late morning and noon, then faded into an uneasy quiet. Outside, rain clung to fir branches and turned the narrow tracks into black mud. Anti-tank obstacles cut jagged lines through the clearings. Wire and mines filled the gaps the forest could not. In the map light, the defensive belt looked complete, measured, layered, rational. It was the kind of position built to make an attacker bleed for every meter, and the officer had spent months believing that was precisely what it would do. Through a periscope slit, he could make out movement at the tree line. American figures gathering without the frantic urgency he expected. No obvious rush into the teeth of the bunkers. No reckless wave into the kill zones. That hesitation felt like confirmation. A fortress, after all, did not need imagination, only endurance. He listened for the sound that would announce the enemy's choice, and for the first time that day, the silence did not feel like safety. For the German engineers who designed this line, the battlefield was a problem already solved. Every bunker, trench, and obstacle had been placed according to doctrine refined over years of war. Fields of fire overlapped. Approaches were narrowed. Terrain itself had been turned into a weapon. The forest, the hills, the mud, none of it was accidental. This was not improvisation. It was calculation. And calculation required assumptions. The first was simple. The Americans would attack directly. History seemed to support it. U.S. forces favored pressure, weight, and momentum. When faced with resistance, they brought artillery. When artillery failed, they brought more of it. The German manuals were clear. Fixed defenses existed to absorb that kind of assault and grind it down. The second assumption followed naturally. The Americans lacked tactical imagination. To German planners, flexibility belonged to maneuver warfare, not to an enemy trained in standardized procedures. The Americans were expected to push forward along roads, probe obvious gaps, and commit armor where armor had always gone before. And the third assumption was the most dangerous of all, that concrete could replace adaptation. Inside the bunkers, officers interpreted everything they saw through these beliefs. American units appeared, paused, and did not rush forward. Patrols moved cautiously, then pulled back. No massed infantry surge came. No desperate frontal charge. The guns remained mostly quiet. To the German command, this was not suspicious. It was reassuring. Reports up the chain described an enemy hesitant, testing, unsure. The delay was read as confusion. The silence as fear. The defensive line was doing exactly what it had been built to do. Hold the attacker in place, drain his momentum, and force him into predictable choices. What no one considered was the possibility that the Americans were not hesitating at all. They were observing, and every minute the defenders spent congratulating themselves on the strength of their positions was another minute the assumptions beneath those positions went unchallenged. The line still stood. The bunkers were intact. The enemy had not yet attacked, but the most important decision of the battle had already been made. Quietly, invisibly, and entirely on the wrong side, night settled over the forest without ceremony. Rain softened the sound of movement, pressing it flat against the earth. From inside the bunkers, German sentries strained to separate imagination from reality. Every snapped branch a possibility, every shadow a false alarm. Yet nothing came. No preparatory bombardment, no probing assault, no unmistakable signal that the battle had begun. To the defenders, this quiet was familiar. It matched doctrine. An attacker facing a hardened line was expected to pause, to gather strength, to hesitate under the weight of what lay ahead. Silence in this logic meant pressure was working. Inside command posts, officers reviewed maps that no longer changed. The geometry still made sense. Fire zones overlapped as designed. Mines waited patiently. The forest funneled movement into predictable corridors. Everything about the line suggested inevitability. And so the silence was explained, not as danger, but as validation. Messages passed upward spoke of an enemy still preparing, still uncertain. There was no urgency in the tone, no demand for adjustment. The system did not reward doubt, it rewarded confirmation. Every hour without contact reinforced the belief that the Americans would eventually do what attackers always did: advance into the killing ground. What the defenders did not see were the small, unremarkable movements beyond their lines. American units shifted positions without concentrating. Engineers walked terrain rather than attacking it. Obstacles were studied, not assaulted. Vehicles moved at night, then stopped. Routes that looked useless on German maps were traced again and again, not for speed, but for possibility. From inside the bunkers, none of this registered as threat. There were no explosions to measure, no losses to count, no obvious point of contact. The German line had been built to respond to force. It had never been designed to respond to absence. By the time the silence began to feel strange, by the time a few officers wondered why the expected attack still had not come, it was already too late to correct the assumption that had shaped everything. The battle was approaching its breaking point, but it would not arrive with noise. The first signs did not look like an attack. There was no sudden roar of artillery, no wave of infantry breaking from the trees. Instead, German forward observers reported scattered movement, machines where soldiers were expected, engineers where riflemen should have been. It did not fit the pattern the defenses had been designed to defeat. American units were not pushing into the strongest points of the line. They were moving around them. Where the bunkers faced open ground, nothing happened. Where the fields of fire overlapped perfectly, the forest remained quiet. The Americans chose approaches that doctrine dismissed as impractical: terrain too broken for armor, routes too narrow to support a frontal assault, paths that offered no obvious tactical payoff. And then the engineers went to work. Rather than battering concrete, they reshaped the ground around it. Obstacles meant to channel movement were cut, bypassed, or turned into markers for alternative routes. Terrain the defenders believed to be protective, mud, trees, slopes, became cover instead of constraint. Vehicles moved where vehicles were not supposed to move, slowly, deliberately, without the urgency that would have exposed them. The German line had been built to kill what approached it. It had not been built to stop what refused to approach at all. Inside the bunkers, the first real confusion appeared. Reports no longer aligned. A position that should have been under pressure reported nothing, while another, previously considered secure, found itself isolated without ever having been attacked. Fire plans assumed mutual support that no longer existed. The defenses had not been breached. They had been outflanked by logic. As American units filtered into spaces the line had defined as irrelevant, the bunkers began to lose their meaning. Concrete that once dominated the battlefield now faced the wrong direction. Fields of fire pointed into emptiness. Communication lines stretched thin, then failed altogether. For the German engineer officer, the realization arrived not as panic, but as disbelief. The system was still intact on paper, but on the ground, it no longer controlled anything. What had been designed as a shield was quietly turning into a trap, one that locked its own defenders into fixed positions, while the enemy moved freely around them. The line had not fallen yet, but it was already being rendered obsolete. The defensive line did not fail with a single dramatic breach. It failed in pieces. One bunker lost contact with the next. A trench that had once fed men and ammunition forward now led nowhere. Positions that had been designed to support each other became isolated islands of concrete, surrounded not by attackers, but by irrelevance. American units appeared where no enemy was supposed to be. Not in mass, not with spectacle, but in small, controlled movements that made response difficult and coordination impossible. The defenders waited for an order to counterattack, an order that assumed a front line still existed. It did not. Fire plans collapsed first. Guns oriented toward expected approaches fired into empty ground, while movement passed through sectors considered secure. Attempts to redirect artillery lagged behind events unfolding faster than the system could process them. The line had been designed for endurance, not for adaptation. Inside the bunkers, the advantage of protection turned into confinement. Narrow firing slits limited vision. Thick walls blocked communication. What had once been safety now separated defenders from reality. The engineer officer watched as reports grew increasingly contradictory. Some positions claimed they were still holding. Others requested support that could not reach them. No single point of failure could be identified, because no single point had failed. The collapse was structural. The Americans did not need to destroy the bunkers. They only needed to make them unnecessary. As routes opened behind the line, supply became impossible. Ammunition dwindled. Wounded men could not be moved. Units that had never been directly attacked found themselves surrounded by terrain, cut off by absence rather than force. By the time German command recognized what was happening, the options were gone. A system built on fixed certainty could not improvise under fluid pressure. The defenders were trapped by the very positions meant to protect them. The line still existed, but it no longer functioned as a line. The realization did not arrive as a sudden revelation. It crept in slowly, through inconsistencies that could no longer be ignored. German officers began to understand that nothing had gone wrong in the way they had been trained to recognize. There had been no overwhelming firepower, no decisive armored thrust, no catastrophic tactical error. The bunkers had not been breached. The obstacles had not been smashed apart. On paper, the defense still existed, and yet it no longer mattered. What had failed was not construction, nor courage, nor preparation. What had failed was the belief that a fixed system could dictate the behavior of a thinking enemy. The defensive line had been designed to hold ground. It assumed that control of terrain equaled control of the battle. But the Americans had not fought for the ground the Germans valued. They had fought for freedom of movement, and in doing so, they had rendered the terrain itself negotiable. For the engineer officer, this truth was especially bitter. He had done everything correctly. The calculations were sound. The concrete was strong. The positions had been placed exactly where doctrine demanded. The line had not been defeated by superior engineering, but by an opponent who refused to play the role assigned to him. The Americans had not been reckless. They had been patient. They had accepted delay, inconvenience, and uncertainty in exchange for flexibility. Where the German system sought certainty through structure, the American approach accepted ambiguity as an advantage. In that contrast lay the real outcome of the battle. This was no longer a question of who held which bunker. It was a confrontation between two ideas of warfare, one that trusted permanence and one that trusted adaptation. And on this battlefield, adaptation proved stronger than concrete. The realization settled heavily across the German command. Defensive strength could slow an enemy, but it could not replace the ability to react. A line could resist force, but it could not respond to imagination. By the time this understanding took hold, the opportunity to change course had passed. The lesson had been learned at the cost of the very system that had been built to prevent such a moment. The defensive line did not disappear when the fighting moved on. Its bunkers remained in the forest. Its concrete still hardened with age. Its geometry could still be traced on maps long after the battle ended. But its authority was gone. What Germany had built was not merely a position, it was a philosophy. A belief that war could be stabilized, predicted, and controlled through structure alone. That if enough effort was poured into preparation, the enemy would be forced to comply with expectation. The battle proved otherwise. The Americans did not win because they were stronger or braver or more willing to suffer losses. They won because they refused to let the battlefield be defined for them. They treated fixed defenses not as obstacles to be destroyed, but as assumptions to be questioned. And once those assumptions collapsed, everything built upon them followed. After the war, militaries studied these moments carefully. Defensive lines did not vanish, but their role changed. Concrete was no longer seen as a solution, only as a delay. Terrain could no longer guarantee control. The center of gravity shifted away from positions and toward decision-making, flexibility, and speed of adaptation. The lesson was quiet, but enduring. War does not reward the side with the most perfect system. It rewards the side that can abandon its system fastest when reality changes. In the end, the German defensive line was not defeated by force. It was defeated by an idea it had never been designed to confront. And that idea, that no plan survives contact with a thinking enemy, would shape warfare long after the concrete had cracked and the forest had grown back around it. Not because the line was weak, but because certainty, once mistaken for security, became its greatest vulnerability.